In this video, we're going to take a look at how someone might try to use the neuroscience experiments we've looked at in an attempt to challenge free will using a sort of very old philosophical challenge known as determinism. So in this preview, we're going to talk about what is determinism. We'll talk about hard determinism and libertarianism. We'll talk about neuroscience and as it relates to hard determinism, neuroscience as it relates to libertarianism. Then we'll talk about what I'm going to call the compatibilist gambit, and we'll distinguish between what's called incompatibilism and compatibilism about free will. And then we'll see how this relates to the three competing definitions that we've already seen. And then we'll look at the relationship between neuroscience and compatibilism. So, historically, many debates about free will occurred in theology and religion. Questions centered around the idea that God seemingly creates us knowing everything we will ever do before we are ever born. And this could make it seem like God is actually the one in control or determining what we do as opposed to us. And so many would worry that this would rob us of free will. Well, today, discussions of free will often occur outside of the theological context and within the sort of scientific context, as we've seen, where someone tries to determine to what extent these sort of physical and environmental factors or influence or determine our choices. This leads us to the view known as physical determinism. So it's the view that a full description of the universe, so everything that's happening here, there, and halfway across the universe, including everything that's happening to every single atom, electron, proton, neutron, everywhere in the universe, take that description and add a list of all the laws of nature, the law of gravity, law of thermodynamics, so 3 laws of motion. That information would entail everything else that happens in the universe, including everything that will ever happen in the future. So I like to represent this as the idea that, and this is a simplified version of that definition, it's the idea that the past plus the laws of nature together sort of equal or determine the future. So there's 2 metaphors that might illustrate the idea of determinism. The first is a metaphor of sort of dominoes. The idea is you get the initial state of the universe set up, maybe all the way back at the Big Bang Theory. But then once something happens and one of those dominoes falls, well, every domino after of it is sort of set up so that everything follows after that. So there's a cause and that causes another thing to happen, which causes another thing to happen, that causes another thing to happen. So that all of it's sort of laid out. And once one thing falls, everything else is determined to happen. It's already set that it's going to happen once we get there. I actually like better this analogy or this sort of metaphor with a sort of movie. So imagine that on Netflix, I watch sort of Toy Story. Well, around 20 minutes in, you'll see Woody push Buzz Lightyear out of the window. Well, what would happen if I paused the movie and rewound it to the very sort of beginning and push play again? Well, still, once I got to 20 minutes, I'd see Woody push Buzz Lightyear out of the window. If I pause it, rewinding it, no matter how many times I rewind it, that's always going to happen at exactly that time. I'm never going to get to 20 minutes in and see Woody have a change of heart and say, I'm not going to push Buzz. Or I'm never going to see Buzz turn around and push Woody out the window. Because the way is basically it's already set by the script. There's something that already determines exactly what's going to happen in the movie. So that no matter how many times you rewind it, you'll never get a different effect. So now, using this, we're able to introduce 3 or 4 philosophical theories concerning free will. The first is hard determinism, the second is libertarianism, the third is compatibilism, and there's sort of 2 versions of this. There's a pessimistic version and an optimistic version. So I want to start out by comparing the hard determinist view and the libertarian view because this is the contrast that people usually think of when the free will debate comes up. So the hard determinist view is that determinism is true and that this rules out the possibility of free will. The libertarian view is that human beings have free will and that rules out determinism. So in other words, the hard determinist believes that deep openness is necessary for free will. So it believes that it has to be the case that you could have done something else. You could have chosen something else even if everything else leading up to your decision was the same. But the hard determinist believes that we live in a deterministic universe, and so none of our choices actually have those alternative options. Thus, they believe that no human being has free will. The libertarian, on the other hand, believes, yet again, that deep openness is necessary for free will. In order for your choices to be free, there have to be alternative options that you could have taken, even if everything leading up to your decision was the same. But they believe that some of your choices are free. And so they conclude that determinism is false. They conclude because you have free will, if I were to rewind time to, say, a second before you made a decision to watch this video, well, you might have chosen not to watch this video instead. Now notice, both views sort of agree on the definition of free will. They agree that free will requires deep openness. And so they both agree that either the ambitious definition of free will is correct or the supernatural definition, since those were the two that required deep openness. But where they disagree is they disagree about what kind of universe we live in. The hard determinist thinks, look, we live in a deterministic universe, and so they conclude we don't have free will. But the libertarian says, no, I think we do have free will, and so they conclude we don't live in a deterministic universe. That's where their difference sort of comes up, but they agree about the definition of free will. So all of this leads to another way someone might use the neuroscience experiments to challenge free will. So when speaking about the depth electrodes experiment, Mealy explains a version of this sort of determinism challenge. The punchline is that pretty specific brain activity seems to lead to a conscious urge to press the key. The recordings were done from the supplementary motor area, an area involved in the preparation and production of bodily actions. The scientists who conducted the experiment don't make any claims about free will in the article that he's discussing, but others see the results as threatening free will. They propose that unconscious brain activity has already determined when the participants will press the key, even before they become aware of their conscious urge to press it. So, someone might think that the neuroscience experiments we have discussed challenge free will by supporting a kind of determinism about our brain. In each of the experiments, whenever a person performed the voluntary action, either maybe pushing the left or right button or pushing a key on the keyboard, scientists were able to find unconscious brain activity prior to that behavior. And so maybe that unconscious brain activity, maybe it's not a decision or intention to perform the action. So we talked about that problem with the original Libet argument, the original neuroscience argument. However, when you see the unconscious brain activity preceding our behavior, even if it's not a decision, you might conclude that whatever it is, the unconscious brain activity is sort of showing how our choice or behavior is determined to happen. Thus, you might thereby believe that neuroscience supports this kind of hard determinism viewpoint and sort of rules out that sort of libertarian notion of free will. The idea is if the unconscious brain activity is there and leading to the sort of choice and behavior, it looks like if I were to rewind time and keep everything in your brain exactly the same and rewind it to the beginning of that unconscious brain activity and push play, you might think, well, that unconscious brain activity is just going to lead to the very same sort of decision and behavior, even if the unconscious brain activity isn't itself a decision. So that is, we look at some behavior, someone pushing the left button or someone pushing the right button, or someone just pushing a key when they do. And we might say, well, where did that behavior come from? Now you might just say, well, look, maybe it's sort of free will, but that behavior, it couldn't just sort of come out of nothing. You can't get something from nothing. It's got to come from somewhere. And now you might sort of say, okay, but it was a conscious choice or urge. So someone had this choice in their sort of mind to push the left button, and that's what caused them to push the left button. But then you might sort of say, well, why did they make that conscious choice? Why did they feel that urge to push the left button rather than the right button? Presumably, yet again, that has to come from somewhere. It just can't come from nothing. Well, where does it come from? It looks like this sort of neuroscience experiment shows us that it comes from some unconscious brain activity is what leads to this sort of feeling of the urge or the awareness of that sort of decision. And so the idea here is it looks like maybe these experiments show how our behavior is determined by these prior causes that we can trace back to this unconscious brain activity. So there's a big problem for using these experiments to challenge free will in this way. And it's that the brain activity measured in the fMRI experiments, it did make predictions that were sort of slightly better than chance, but it was only 60% accuracy. I can get 50% accuracy predicting which button you'll push just by flipping a coin and sort of saying, well, heads, I'm going to say they do left, tails, they do right. My prediction will be right 50% of the time, so I lose a little bit of accuracy, but I could make that prediction a minute in advance or an hour in advance. But that's not very impressive. Similarly, look, the brain activity measured with the depth electrodes is slightly better. It's making predictions with 80% accuracy. But notice, that still seems to fall short of showing that the unconscious brain activity is determining, is guaranteeing what the person's choices or behavior will be. So it's possible that the unconscious brain activity that the neuroscientists are measuring, maybe it does play a role in producing our behavior, but maybe it does so without determining or guaranteeing that behavior. So Mealy asks us to consider the difference between whenever you wiggle your finger, some unconscious brain signal S occurs beforehand. Now that's to say that the brain signal is necessary to get you to wiggle your finger. Compare that, though, to a claim that says, well, whenever you have that brain activity, you wiggle your finger. This suggests that the brain signal is not sort of necessary, but it is sufficient to get your finger to wiggle. So you must establish that number 2 is true in order to prove that the brain signal S determines your behavior, namely wiggling the finger. But the neuroscience experiments have only shown number 1. They've only shown that maybe this unconscious brain activity is necessary for getting the behavior. It's still possible that you might get that brain activity without the sort of behavior afterwards. And that would show that the brain activity doesn't guarantee or determine that behavior. It's possible that the brain signal sometimes arises, produces an urge to wiggle your finger, but sometimes you make a conscious choice to act on that urge, and other times you make a conscious choice to resist that urge. We all oftentimes have that sort of feeling where maybe you feel the temptation or urge to do something and go, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to resist. So even if the urge is sort of caused by some unconscious brain activity, that doesn't mean that the brain activity determines or guarantees that you're actually going to perform the behavior that you feel the urge to do. However, another worry for free will arises even if you deny that your conscious choices are determined. So let's say you sort of make those maneuvers and you show, look, you haven't shown that my decisions, my behavior is determined by this unconscious behavior for these reasons. Well, and then you sort of say, so maybe these decisions, this behavior is undetermined. Well, here's a problem, though, that plagues this kind of libertarianism, where it rejects determinism altogether. If you say that our decisions have this kind of deep openness, where the choice is undetermined, it looks like that makes your choice random, because it says everything could be exactly the same leading up to your sort of decision. The brain activity could be exactly the same. Your thoughts could be exactly the same. Your mood could be exactly the same. The reasons, pro and con, for making that decision could be exactly the same. But sometimes you might say yes, sometimes you might say no. If we were to rewind time and sort of do it over and over and over again, and you might just say, well, why do you choose to do it one time when we rewind, and why don't you the other time? Well, there's no answer because it's not determined. And it's to that extent, it makes it look like your decision is just random chance. But you don't have control over a random outcome. And so it looks like if you go this route and you say, no, this behavior is not determined by anything, then it looks like you're also stuck in this sort of thing that we don't have control over it since it's not determined by us. All right, so moreover, if the libertarian uses the supernatural definition of free will, there's the additional worry that's mysterious how a choice that's made in a non-physical soul or mind could cause anything to happen in our physical body, like wiggling our finger. This is known as the interaction problem for dualism. I only mention it here briefly we're not going to harp on it. We'll talk about it later when we talk about dualism later in the course. So at this point, there's a kind of gambit you can make. Notice, on one view, you might say, okay, here's this neuroscience, and it seems to suggest that our behavior choices are determined. And then you might say, well, because it does that, it looks like those choices aren't free. It looks like that behavior is not a matter of our free will. Then the person who likes free will comes back and says, look, hold on, but your predictions are only 60% accurate or 80% accurate. And you haven't shown that this unconscious brain activity sort of guarantees that you'll perform this. And so it's still possible that our choices are undetermined. But then that libertarian has the worry of, well, to that extent, aren't those choices just random? There's a way to try to find a middle ground between the hard determinist view and the libertarian view, and it's what's known as compatibilism. And this is a view that says our choices could be both determined and free. You might be thinking, how is that possible? Well, remember, determinism is not defined as a denial of free will. It's defined as a hypothesis about what kind of world we live in, about how our world works, how the physical world works. Now, on this view, it just believes that deep openness is not necessary for free will. On this view, our choices are free when they're determined in the right way. So when our choices are determined by our own rational, informed decisions, then they are a matter of our free will. And our choices are not free when they're determined in the wrong way, say by excessive force. So on this view, the difference between having free will and not having free will is not the difference between your choices being determined or being undetermined. It's a difference between being determined in the right way versus being determined in the wrong way. So let's go back to some of those definitions of free will that we looked at last week. The ambitious and supernatural meanings of free will, so that those are the mid-grade and premium definitions, these are incompatibilist. So if determinism is true, then no choices have deep openness. And so if determinism is true, the past and the laws of nature guarantee that there's only one choice we could make in that moment. And so the ambitious and supernatural meaning, since they say free will requires that we have multiple options open to us at that moment, determinism would rule out free will on those definitions. But the modest definition of free will is compatibilist. So to say that you can make rational, informed decisions without excessive force says nothing about whether those choices were determined. It just says they are the product of your of an informed, rational decision that you've made. So on this conception, even if neuroscience proves that our choices or behavior are determined, which it's not clear that it does, this wouldn't disprove free will unless it also shows that they're determined by the wrong kinds of things. So we can thereby distinguish two versions of compatibilism. There's the optimistic version and a pessimistic version. The optimistic version says they believe that our choices are at least sometimes caused or determined in the right way and are thereby sort of the result of our free will. A pessimistic version says our choices are always caused in the wrong way and so are never free. And so now I think one way to understand the Libet experiments and the other neuroscience experiments is to try and argue it's not just that they're trying to argue that our choices or behavior are determined, but rather that they're caused or determined in the wrong way. Specifically, they're caused by our unconscious sort of brain activity as opposed to our own conscious thoughts. And that's the wrong way for them to be caused in order to have even compatibilist free will. So I think that's actually a bigger worry than the one that just appeals to determinism. But the main worry for a compatibilist view of free will is the following. If my biology, so my genes, and the initial environment I'm born into, say the kind of family I'm born into, are out of my control, then it seems as if any choices that are determined by these factors are also out of my control. And so that would seem to support the view that free will and determinism are incompatible after all. So the idea here is, look, Yes, I'm able to make rational, informed decisions sometimes, but it looks like the way that I reason, the beliefs I have, the preferences I have, the values I have, the desires I have, you might think are largely a product of my biology and my upbringing. But I don't get to choose the genes that I'm born with. I don't get to choose the environment I'm born into. I don't choose I didn't choose to be born in the United States. I didn't choose to be born in Minnesota. So we have no control over whether we're born in the US or China or India or South Africa. You don't have any control over whether you're born into a loving family or an abusive family, whether you're born into a rich family or a poor family. But all of those things seem to have a huge influence on the kinds of beliefs you have, the kinds of desires you have, the kinds of preferences you have, and how you think through situations. And so the idea here is, look, even if my decisions are the result of my own sort of rational, informed decision making, if the way I reason about those decisions is determined by all those things outside of my control, then it doesn't seem like I have any control over those decisions either. And so it looks like free will and determinism are not compatible, as the compatibilist wants to say. All right, so I know this video sort of dove into a little bit more complicated sort of philosophical territory with those distinctions between compatibilism and incompatibilism, but it's really important for trying to assess what this neuroscience does or does not say about free will. So that's it for now. I'll see you next time.